Thank you for joining us today for this launch of the 2022 World Justice Project Rule of Law Index. And thank you for working to advance the rule of law in your own community, your country, and around the globe. The rule of law, by which we mean accountability, just laws, open government, and accessible justice, has always been foundational. And now it is more important than ever. The rule of law faces enormous pressure from challenges such as global health crises, rising authoritarianism, weakened human rights, and disputed elections. We cannot have communities of justice, opportunity, and peace without the rule of law. It's critical that we understand whether and how governments and communities adhere to the rule of law. And that's exactly what our index does. Now, let me introduce our Executive Director, Elizabeth Anderson, who will moderate today's program.
Thank you, Bill, and welcome to everyone joining us today for the live presentation of the 2022 World Justice Project Rule of Law Index. Please take a moment and drop us a line in the comments section on your screen to let us know where you're coming from. By last count, we had people joining in this audience from 159 countries and territories, and we want to know where you hail from. Also, feel free to post questions there at any time during the program. We'll hope to circle back and pose a few of those to our panelists a little later in the program. Last year, we told you that rule of law was declining globally for the fourth year in a row. We saw these multi-year declines exacerbated by the pandemic, deepening and spreading to more countries. With the release of the 2022 index today, we will learn whether this downward trend continues, whether the rule of law has rebounded from COVID-era declines, and where we might look for some hopeful signs of reform. So now let me bring into the program colleagues who have led the intensive process that goes into producing the WJP Rule of Law Index every year. I'm joined today by our Chief Research Officer, Alejandro Ponce, and co-director of the World Justice Project Rule of Law Index, Alicia Evangelidis. Colleagues, welcome.
Thank you, Betsy. Happy to be here.
Great to be here. Thanks, Betsy.
Alex, let me start with you. As one of the original creators of the index, tell our audience a little bit about it and what it measures.
Well, the index is a tool to measure adherence to the rule of law in practice through a set of 8 outcome indicators or factors: constraints on government powers, absence of corruption, open government, fundamental rights, order and security, regulatory enforcement, civil justice, and criminal justice. These 8 factors are disaggregated into 44 sub-factors that capture outcomes that rule of law societies want to achieve, such as whether the civil justice is accessible, effective, timely, or free of government interference. These indicators are populated by data collected from the public and from in-country experts around the world.
Great, thanks, Alex. So let me ask our audience to contemplate those factors and let us know, put in the comments where you're coming from and what factors you're most concerned about in your country. We're really excited about our new interactive website where you can probe the data, and a little later in the program, we will show you how you can look into the data for your country and the issues, the factors that most concern you. So while folks are doing that, Alicia, let me turn to you and ask you to tell the audience, how do we go about gathering this data every year?
Sure thing. So in order to assess the rule of law in different countries, the WJP administers surveys to both the general public and to legal practitioners and experts living in each country. So our data actually comes from individuals who experience the rule of law on a day-to-day basis in their countries. We clean the data, we organize the data, and we aggregate the data to produce sub-factor and then factor scores, which reflect adherence to the rule of law. We then average those factor scores to create an overall rule of law score for each country. We also perform extensive quantitative and qualitative checks to validate the data and ensure the reliability of our analysis. The report that we're presenting today summarizes the experiences and perceptions of more than 154,000 everyday people and more than 3,600 legal experts and practitioners interviewed in 140 countries and jurisdictions around the world. This year, we're really excited to include Gabon in the index for the first time as well. You can see all of the 2022 data in this year's index report, and we've summarized the main findings of this year's index in our Insights booklet. You can find both of these reports on our website now, along with current and historical data. And you can also do your own analysis on our interactive data microsite, which will debut later in the presentation.
Great. So thanks for that introduction to the methodology. Now, what everyone's been waiting for, let's turn to the major findings from this year's index. Alex, what does the 2022 index tell us about the current state of the rule of law around the world?
Well, unfortunately, around the world, the rule of law continued to weaken. Over the past year, the rule of law declined in 61% of the countries that we measure and improved in 39%. So what that means is that 85 of the countries that we studied declined in rule of law, or in other words, that 4.4 billion people live in countries where the rule of law is weaker than it was last year. These declines are widespread around the world and seen in all corners. However, something that is interesting is that the rule of law weakened even more in countries where the rule of law was already weak.
And how does this compare to previous years?
Well, the index shows that for the fifth year in a row, the rule of law is declining. As you can see in the graph, the percentage or the proportion of declining countries in red and the proportion of declining countries or improving countries in blue has the proportion declined this year.
So there was a spike in those red decliners last year, the pandemic year, and we've seen that now come down a bit this year. Should we see that as a sign that we are emerging from a rule of law recession? How do we interpret that data?
Well, I wouldn't say that, Betsy. The last year was really tough due to the pandemic. As we can see in the graph, the proportion of declining countries peaked at the height of the health crisis. That proportion declined this year, as we can see in the graph. However, that proportion is still higher than the proportion of improving countries, as we can see in the gap at the right of the graph. Indeed, even though the rule of law declined in fewer countries this year as compared to last year, in 2/3 of the countries where the rule of law declined in 2020, declined again in 2021. In addition, the magnitude or the change of rule of law in declining countries was larger than the change in improving countries.
So what were the main drivers of that continued weakening of the rule of law this year?
So as you can imagine, there are a lot of driving factors, and in countries that are declining, we often see declines in several of the factors. However, we can identify some interesting patterns in the data. And overall, there are three factors or drivers that explain this year's results. The first one is constraints on government powers or checks and balances, such as constraints on the legislator, by the judiciary, independent audit and review, or non-governmental checks. Scores in this factor decline in 58% of the countries by an average decrease of about 0.7%. This is a continuous trend that we have seen over several years. However, the decline weren't as pronounced as last year. Second is civil justice. So this indicator fell in 61% of the countries, mainly due to continued delays, as we saw last year during the pandemic, weak enforcement, and discrimination. Finally, fundamental rights. So these factors measures the protection that, or how much countries protect a set of fundamental rights, such as equal treatment, freedom of opinion and expression, freedom of assembly, or due process, to name a few. This indicator fell in 66% of the countries, driven mainly by growing authoritarianism growing discrimination and a shrinking of the civic space.
So it seems that some countries are shaking off the pandemic effects, but overall, the rule of law continues to decline in a majority of countries. Alicia, how does this fit into the longer term trends we see in the data?
So unfortunately, we see a pretty similar trend in the long term. Since 2015, the rule of law has declined in 64% of the countries that we study in our index. This has largely been driven by authoritarian tendencies, including weaker checks and balances, diminished accountability, and an erosion of fundamental rights. And we can see this phenomenon in our index scores. If we look at our factors over time, we can see that between 2015 and 2022, all but one factor has declined in the majority of countries. On the leftmost bar, you can see that factor 1, which is constraints on government powers, has declined in 68% of countries in our index. And fundamental rights in the fourth bar has declined more than any other factor by 76% of countries. The only factor that actually improved in a majority of countries during this period was regulatory enforcement, or factor 6, with 59% of countries recording improvements.
You mentioned declining respect for fundamental rights. Tell us a little bit more about that and what it looks like. Which rights exactly are most under threat?
Of course. So one of our indicators, right to life and security, measures whether political dissidents or the media are subjected to things like unreasonable searches, detention, threats, or abusive treatment. Since 2015, we have seen this indicator decline in 66% of the countries in our index. Freedom of opinion and expression has declined in 81% of countries, and freedom of assembly and association has fallen in 85% of countries over the long term.
Those are some really concerning trends when it comes to people's core freedoms and their ability to participate in government and governance of their communities and actually keep the rule of law strong. Thank you, Alex and Alicia. I'm going to come back to you in a little bit to hear more about some specific countries and regions. But first, let me bring in another speaker, someone who can speak directly to the core freedoms that we've just heard are under threat. John Neary is an award-winning journalist from the Philippines, and he is active in efforts there and around the world to help journalists organize themselves and defend attacks on media freedom. We at the WJP are lucky to count John among our board members, and I'm delighted to have him join us today. John, welcome. John, it's great to have you with us.
Thank you, Betsy. Happy to be here.
What do you make of the trends that we just heard about from Alex and Alicia? And in fact, that 81% of countries have seen a decline in freedom of expression and opinion in recent years. Why is this happening so widely, and what is the impact that you see?
I think the reality is that we're in the middle of yet another illiberal moment in history when the authoritarian temptation has yet again become harder and harder to resist. There are many factors such as inequality, injustice, impunity. I'm reminded the constitutional scholars Ginsburg and Huck identify what they call the three basic predicates of a working democracy. And the fundamental rights that we're speaking of, free expression and free association, form the second of these three predicates. I think that is why there is so much pressure on these freedoms. And I think that is why the index continues to reflect the weight of this pressure. It's not an accident, it's a pattern. The authoritarian tendency is to attack these fundamental freedoms.
And then on top of those pressures, we also have the challenge of disinformation. Tell us a little bit about how you see that playing out and how we grapple with it.
You know, I'm reminded of that famous New York Daily News cartoon that suggests that disinformation may be the fifth horseman of the apocalypse. I think the first thing for us to do is to accept that there is, in fact, a disinformation crisis. A crisis fueled by social media, yes, but not by social media alone. It is a multi-dimensional problem. So to grapple with it, we, not just journalists alone, not just lawyers and rule of law advocates alone, but all of us, the whole of society, we must fight it on all those dimensions. For instance, we must hold the platforms to the strictest account. We must force a reckoning with the surveillance business models. But at the same time, we must all also support our local newspaper, our library, our university. We must push back against common thematic lies. But at the same time, we must also grow and develop our audiences, make them more discerning, more critical. There is so much work to be done.
Indeed, there is. And you've been talking about these trends in broad terms, John, but personally, you and your colleagues at Rappler, the premier independent Filipino news organization, you're in the midst of these pressures yourselves under the leadership of Nobel Peace Prize winning journalist Maria Ressa. You've been under attack before leaving office. President Duterte's government cracked down on Rappler and tried to shut it down. Tell us a little bit about where that stands and what you're facing.
Unfortunately, the attacks on different fronts continue even under the second President Marcos. The move to strip Rappler of its corporate status remains a real threat. The cyber libel case against Maria Ressa and Reynaldo Santos needs to be elevated to the Supreme Court. Other lawsuits are ongoing. And the continuing and orchestrated campaign of abuse against Rappler and its reporters, well, that remains a very real thing. But I would like to stress it's not just Rappler. Other media organizations in the Philippines are under attack as well. Again, it's not an accident, it's a pattern. The evil genie that President Duterte released, the second President Marcos is not able to put back in the bottle. And honestly, it remains to be seen whether President Marcos wants, in fact, to put the genie back in the bottle.
Sobering indeed. So it seems that in the Rappler case, as in so many other critical moments when the rule of law hangs in the balance, it may come down to whether an independent judiciary is willing to stand up as a trusted arbiter and bulwark for the rule of law. We've seen that not just in the context of media freedom, but particularly in the context of elections in recent years. In my own country, the United States, in 2000 and again in 2020. And we see it in other places as well. What do you see in terms of independent judiciary activity in your work and elsewhere, John?
Yes, we need a strong and independent judiciary. And we are encouraged by many lower court decisions back here in the Philippines that uphold some very fundamental rights. But the recent elections in Kenya provide us another larger scale example. I had the privilege of moderating a rule of law solution session at our World Justice Forum last June. And the session started with us hearing from the Chief Justice of Kenya, Martha Koome. I was struck by what she said about the need for solutions to go beyond the judiciary, she said. In other words, for reforms to actually be rooted in everyday life. I think that can only help strengthen the position of the judiciary, any judiciary. And I think that also helped allow the Kenyan Supreme Court in the last elections to rule quickly and decisively.
Thank you, John. Our discussion highlights the role of elections as a real test for the rule of law. And I think I'm going to invite Alex and Alicia to come back and share with us what they see in the index findings regarding elections and the rule. Alex and Alicia, this coming weekend is Brazil's runoff election, and the United States has its midterm elections just a little less than 2 weeks from now. In both these countries and in many others, as John was just reminding us, there are concerns that losing candidates will refuse to accept election results. What can the index data tell us about this dynamic and trends in the rule of law in the context of elections?
Well, one of the really important things that the index measures is the perception of electoral processes and transfers of power, including things like perceptions about the legality and the integrity of the electoral process, access to the ballot, the absence of intimidation, or the public scrutiny of election results. In recent years, we've seen a steady decline in this indicator in our index. Since 2015, 67% of countries we've studied have seen a decline in this subfactor. But actually, there is another side to what the index has to say about transition of power. When we look at the top improvers this year, we see that 3 of the 5 countries, which are Honduras, Belize, and the United States, all had recent elections and changes in administration, which suggests that people really do have the power to change course, and when it happens peacefully, it can strengthen the rule of law. Honduras and Belize have made up for recent declines, while the US still has ways to go after experiencing some of the biggest declines in the world in the previous years.
Interesting. And what about the other 2 top improvers?
The other 2 top improvers also have something in common. Kosovo and Moldova are both trying to join the European Union, which has very strict rule of law requirements for both candidate and member states.
Very interesting. Yes, indeed. We see that in general, Western Europe and EU member states are leaders in the rule of law. And we at the WJP had the pleasure of hearing from European Commissioner Vera Jourova at our World Justice Forum this past May. She underscored the importance of the rule of law in the EU. And she talked about the war in Ukraine and the real threat that EU member states feel to the rule of law in that context. Let's play that clip.
Faced with Russia's unprovoked and unjustified military aggression against Ukraine, we need now, more than ever, to say how crucially important the rule of law is, both within and outside Europe. We should not forget that the reasons why Ukrainians are fighting for their country is because they freely chose to build it on the principles of democracy and the rule of law. We see people dying for these ideals.
Those are high stakes indeed. Let's talk about Ukraine. Alex, before Russia's illegal invasion, Ukraine was improving its rule of law year over year. What do we see in this year's data?
Well, Ukraine's rule of law score declined this year by almost 2% and lost 2 places in the global ranking. However, as you mentioned, it remains among the top improvers in rule of law in recent years. Indeed, as we can see in the map, Ukraine, together with 4 other neighbors of Russia, are among the top 10 improvers in rule of law in the last 7 years.
And you can really see a sharp contrast there with Russia in the bright red in this map, where there's been a steep decline in the rule of law in that same period. We've already talked about Moldova earlier. Tell us about the other Russian neighbors on this list, Alex. What's going on there?
Well, Estonia has been a high performer for many years, and indeed it broke into the top 10 overall rankings of the index this year. They are ranked 9th above Austria or Ireland. They have been leaders for several years in e-government, and they have implemented policies to make the government more open, accessible, and responsive to people. The other 2 countries, Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, were authoritarian states that in recent years have launched ambitious liberalization processes, as some countries in Eastern Europe and Central Asia did a few years ago. But this has been very intentional. Indeed, we have had conversations with them to explain the index findings so that they can indeed inform the reform processes.
Right. The Justice Minister of Uzbekistan, Ruslanbek Davletov, spoke about his country's rule of law efforts at our World Justice Forum this past May. And we talked to him as well as some others off the stage. to hear a little bit more about that, their views of the rule of law, why it's important, and how they work with the index data in advancing reforms. Let's take a look at how he and others describe that work.
I think rule of law is a single concept that can make change the lives of the people, even if you don't have like really proper economic development program, or you don't have national resources. Rule of law itself can make your country develop, because you will have the maximum effectiveness of the public expenditure. You will have the government agencies under control by the public oversight. You will have a good parliament. You will have a good laws and implementation.
For us, the rule of law is everything. If you don't have the rule of law, if compliance is not applied because of a strength of the rule of law and the justice system to back it up, then the backbone of justice is absent.
Rule of law is critical to our ability to go into a country and say, this is how we will perform, this is what we will do with governments, this is what we will not do with governments, because we believe in the importance of protecting the rights of our end users to their data.
At Transparency IT, we are very, very happy that the Rule of Law Index of the World Justice Project exists, because it has been a great tool that we've been using to advocate at this grassroots for our accountable and transparent criminal justice system.
Rule of Law Index is very important for us, because this index is well respected around the globe, and the findings of the index, they are used in other rankings as well. World Bank and other really highly respected institutions.
Well, I mentioned the importance of actually understanding rule of law and whether laws can be trusted and whether they will be enforced fairly and predictably. And the Rule of Law Index is great on that, among other dimensions, in that you can see year over year whether the trust in the courts and in the legal services, the judiciary, is growing or declining, and we see both flags in the index itself.
The index has also helped us to identify the true situation of criminal justice system in Nigeria, using the data to guide our activities, particularly inform our decisions in terms of the work we do at Transparency IT, which is very important in tackling corruption.
The Rule of Law Index is a really valuable tool. These tools, wherever they come from, and frankly this one, because of the expertise, is really, really important for people trying to understand why there's such distrust in the world, what we have to do about it to rebuild the rule of law. You've got to start with the evidence.
I invite all stakeholders globally to join hands and work with the World Justice Project and use the Rule of Law Index in helping them to accelerate justice, in helping them to promote accountable society, in helping them to promote transparent and accountable public system in their countries.
Well, we really hope you take Abbas Anua up on his invitation to use the index as a tool to accelerate your own work advancing the rule of law. And to that end, we're sharing the QR code again for the index, or you can go straight to the website. It's super easy. It's worldjusticeproject.org/index. We're really excited, as I mentioned earlier, about some of the enhancements to our website that make it more accessible and useful to you to interact with the data and probe the issues that are of interest to you. And for that, I want to turn to Alicia for a short demo so you can see for yourself.
Great, thanks, Betsy. I am happy to do that. I'm going to share my screen so you can follow along with me. So hopefully everyone can see my screen now. And Betsy, you had asked the audience to tell us the countries that they're joining us from and some of the issues that they're working on. Can you select one of each for me, please?
Yeah, we have an audience member from Turkey who's interested in fundamental rights.
Great, let's take a look at that. So we're going to start here on our rankings page. If you hover over a country, so Turkey, for example, you can see at a quick glance the global and regional rankings for the country for the current year. You can also see whether your country's score has improved or declined. So Turkey's score has actually declined over the past year. And then if you scroll down, you can see the global rankings for all countries in our index. Now let's look at some of the country-specific data. So again, for Turkey, first you will click on countries up in the top menu bar. And then you can either click on a country on the map, or you can use this drop-down menu to search for your country. So I will do that and select it from the drop-down menu. Now, again, quickly at a glance, you can get all of the summary information for your country. Right here, we have all of Turkey's 2022 data up on the screen. And in the upper right-hand corner under downloads, you can actually, there's an option to download the country profile and the country data set, which will provide you with historical data for the country. Then if I want to look at fundamental rights, as our colleague in the audience is working on, I would click on the Factors tab, again, up in the upper menu. And then you can see, we'll have to scroll down to Fundamental Rights. And again, you can see all of the information for that factor and sub-factor for Turkey itself. Which is really great. So here we can see that Turkey actually ranks 134th out of 140 countries in fundamental rights. And then something that we're really excited about this year is our new sharing feature. If you go up to the share button in the top right-hand corner, you can share the rankings for factor level data for a country in any of these different social media platforms. So say I want to share this on LinkedIn. I just click on the LinkedIn icon. And it will pull up Turkey's rank for me on fundamental rights, which is really great. I can share that easily via LinkedIn from here. And then also, if you are on a specific country page, you can share a country's global ranking through any of our social media platforms as well.
That's super. Thank you so much, Alicia. And we're going to put the QR code back up on the screen so folks can follow it to the index site and start poking around in the data and sharing it as you suggest. Before we wrap up, I think we have time for one question from the audience. So I think I've got one here from Nitin Kumar asking, sending a question from India. And Nitin is asking about the data, how it's collected. Alicia, maybe you can elaborate a little bit on how the data is collected for each country and how that informs our analysis of the trends in rule of law, not just for each country, but for the whole world. So Alicia, over to you.
Sure, it's a great question. Thank you for that question, Nitin. So in order to collect our data, as we mentioned in the beginning, we administer surveys. We administer two different types of surveys. One is to the general public, and those are administered for the most part in person. So we actually work with local polling companies who will go house to house, door to door, and collect a sample of usually about 1,000 people in each country. We administer the same questionnaire to each person, so the data is comparable among the general population. So that's one side of our survey data collection. We also administer surveys to legal experts and academics and practitioners in each country. Those are all administered online, so it's a little bit easier for us to collect the data in that way. But yes, we administer surveys both in person and online to our the general public and to experts. And then once we collect all of that data, we take that data and we map it to our conceptual framework, to the factors and sub-factor level data. For more information on that, you can see our variable map online, and that tells you actually which questions go to which factors and sub-factors and actually how all of the scores are calculated and with the formulas and everything. But we map all of the data to our conceptual framework and come up with average scores for each factor and sub-factor. And then comparing that to years before, we can see whether or not a score has declined for a country or improved for a country.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Alicia. And thank you, Alex and Alicia and your teams for this terrific work pulling together this year's index. Congratulations to you. Before I turn over to the chair of our board, William Hubbard, for some final reflections about how all of us in the audience can take this work forward, let me say some additional thank yous. First, as I was just suggesting, a huge thanks goes to the dozens of WJP staff members who work with Alex and Alicia to gather and painstakingly check and analyze this data. You heard it earlier, over 150,000 surveys from households, 3,600 plus experts. That's a huge amount of data that is gathered and very carefully checked and put together in this index. We also owe a huge thanks to the thousands of practitioners who complete those surveys, and maybe some of you who are on the call today will raise your hands to complete surveys next year. We'd welcome that. The more data, the better. We also thank our polling partners who undertake the household data collection. All of this annual data collection is a monumental task. It is a gift to the world, and we are enormously grateful to all of you and Alex and Alicia for leading this work. You and your team, job well done. I also want to take a moment to thank the many donor agencies, foundations, members of WJP's private sector partnership for the rule of law, and individual donors whose support makes this possible. A full list of our supporters is available in the index and on our website, and we invite you to join them by making a gift to the World Justice Project. Now, for some concluding remarks, let me turn to WJP's board chair, William Hubbard.
Thank you for joining us today. It has been illuminating to learn about the latest index findings. Let me close by saying we hope that you will use this tool as so many businesses, governments, multilateral organizations, and civil society organizations already are. The World Justice Project Rule of Law Index serves as a critical benchmark and measuring stick in efforts to advance justice and the rule of law. That's why it is used in national development plans, international organization metrics, and advocacy campaigns around the world. As the data shows, the global rule of law recession continues. Authoritarianism is rising, and people are losing fundamental rights. But we have also shown you bright spots bucking this trend. On-the-ground reform and advocacy movements fighting long-entrenched challenges. The truth is, we can do something about the rule of law. We can and we must. I invite you to add the Rule of Law Index to your own toolbox in whatever way you are working to bring justice to the world. The challenges are great, but we can and we will overcome them if we work hard and we work together. On behalf of all of us at the World Justice Project, thank you very much for joining us for our program today and in this vital movement for the rule of law.